Hi everybody, I'm Anna from Post Me a Book. I finally managed to read the two books that I'd planned to read. That's probably taken me a bit longer than it did anyway. But yeah, I've done it, so that was well done. So I'm going to talk about two books. The first one being this one that's called 48 Guns for the General by Iroh. And the second one I'll show up later, which is called The Keepers by Pauline Kirk. But to start with this one, this book, as I said in my first video, was not one that I would have chosen when I was younger, just because the cover doesn't quite work for me. Well, it didn't then. It actually works quite well for me now, being when I feel it, it's nice and glossy. Now that I've read the book, actually, the cover's sort of grown on me. Perhaps I'm not sure that I would have picked it up because of the cover, but as I said, now that I am a little bit more mature, I can pick up books and read them even if I don't like the cover. But I don't have to. Anyway, focusing. 48 Guns by the General is written by Iroh. It's a book about the Biafran War, which took place in 1967 1970 in Nigeria. It's a civil war between the Nigerian army and the Biafran people, who had declared themselves independent in 1967. So they were trying to gain their independence, and the Nigerian army just were not having it. So that's what the Biafran War was about. Well, that's not all that it's about, but that's part of what it's about. I hadn't read much about the Biafran War before I actually read this book, and this book doesn't tell you so much about that either, but I didn't have context, that's to say. I know that Biafran War took place in Nigeria. I knew that before I read the book, and I knew that it was about the Igbo people, but more than that I didn't know. And as I said, you don't get much history, much background from the book itself. But the book, it's about different groups of people. There's the Biafran army, or a few members of the Biafran army. There's the mercenaries who were brought in by the general of the Biafran army. And then there's the divisions within the mercenaries, because the mercenary groups, the group of mercenaries, they're different. They come from different places, so they're not all buddy-buddy with each other. They don't necessarily know each other. They might have met in different wars, but more than that, they haven't. Yeah, what was I about to explain? That the mercenaries are all from different groups or different places. So we have Jacques Rudolph, who becomes the head of the mercenary group. Now he has his own agenda, and he's getting on in years, and he wants this war to be his very last. So he's gonna make as much money as possible so he can retire and live out his life, I guess. So his plan is to actually prolong this war so he can make as much money as possible. And then there is Georges Denault, I think it's pronounced. He's been brought in by the French government, who are trying to scheme. Well, they want to scheme and try and get their claws into the claws. They want to see how it plays out so that they can have some advantage in the future, some underhand advantage in the future if they help out the Biafran people. And then there's there's a British mercenary who's been brought in by the British, who also have the same kind of scheme as Georges and the French government. The British also want to be able to have an upper hand on others when it comes to the Biafran people. So they're helping out just in order to help themselves in the future, so to speak. And then of course there are the other mercenaries. There are a few other mercenaries who were mentioned who have a little bit of a bigger role than the other members, because this is 48 mercenary people. 48 mercenary people. 48 mercenaries, I mean, who were brought in by the general. But it's not all of them who are mentioned. And then another group that's mentioned is some individuals in the Biafran army. Colonel Chuma, is one of them. Major Dimke is another one of them. And Michael is another one of them. Colonel Chuma becomes quite important because at the beginning of the book he's mentioned. He's just been promoted to colonel, and he starts out by helping the Biafran army win ground which they hadn't been gaining. And he becomes such a hero because he manages to save a lot of lives, and he manages to give them a big advantage. But then something goes wrong, and the general's not happy, so he throws him into prison, where he languishes there for 9 months, 12 months. So that was him there for 12 months. So Major Dimke is out on the field, but we don't hear about him in the beginning of the book, not so much in any case. And Michael is a young soldier who is the driver to the mercenaries, and he's quite close to the general. That's to say, he's not close to the general in that he has the general's ear. It's just that he has contacts with the general, and he kind of hears what's going on, and he's the one who drives the mercenaries hither and thither on wherever they want to go. But Rudolph manages to convince Michael that he's a good person, which, as we know, he's not. And the other thing is, the mercenaries go around calling themselves the Christian Brothers because the general didn't want the Biafran people to know that these are actual mercenaries. So they all think they're just white people who are there to help them out in the war, win the war, which, as we know, is not true. So the storyline is pretty much about these characters. It's not so much about the war. You don't hear very much about the rebels. So as I was saying, the story is very much about these characters and their wielding and dealing and backstabbing each other and scheming and doing off with one another. I've got to say that it was a very good, or it seems to be a very good film book. The story is very cinematic. Eddie Iroh manages to keep the suspense going. He manages to keep you hanging on to the point where he can stop a paragraph, leaving you wanting to know what happens next, just leaving you hanging. And you've got to read on to perhaps the next chapter in Swedish, chapter, to find out what's going on. I also like the fact in this book that Eddie Iroh, he remains impartial or neutral to the mercenaries. That's to say, as the author, his voice doesn't come out of whether he likes or whether he doesn't like the mercenaries. He doesn't bring out any loathing, any dislike, any bile feelings. I think that's just me, so let's move on from that. He remains impartial. But what does happen is that this does come out through Colonel Chuma, who actually realizes what the mercenaries are about, and he has no love lost as far as mercenaries are concerned. So that's where you realize that someone doesn't like the mercenaries, apart from myself, that is. Someone else doesn't like the mercenaries. So I thought that was pretty good that he actually remains neutral, even with the fact that he was in the Biafran War and he was reporting it. This book actually, the whole story, it comes to a climax when Jacques Rudolph and the mercenaries who are still backing him actually find themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place, where they actually have to fight the war to win it, or they have to cut their losses and flee. And so, not to give away the whole story, the ending is pretty much about this, but it actually goes on a little bit beyond just this bit. But I think it could be said that it's an unexpected ending to some extent. The heroes who should win, do win. The ones who shouldn't, well, let's leave it at that, leave you hanging. All I can say now is that it is well worth reading this book. I was very surprised. Pleasantly surprised that it was as it was. And I'll stop there.